It began with imagination and a pair of dice.
It was a social experience. A group of friends gathered to tell a story together. That's something that no one had ever seen before.
And it merged our world with theirs.
You've got action, you've got romance, you've got adventure, exploration, and it can go on like a soap opera for as long as you want it to go on.
Some people would fight it.
Dungeons & Dragons was heavy metal before heavy metal was heavy metal. I mean, it was the thing that people were really afraid of.
And others would embrace it.
Well, Baldur's Gate, wow, why was it so successful? You know, it clicked on a lot of things and just did them right. So if you're a D&D fan, here was a great way to go in and play a game where you could basically test out some of your ideas about tactics and that sort of thing.
But it altered the course of the gaming industry forever. This is the story of Dungeons & Dragons. The snowy winters of Lake Geneva, Wisconsin provide long hours for indoor entertainment. And in 1970, this perfect setting brings together two people and one incredibly unique idea.
Dungeons & Dragons came out of a long line of wargaming. Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson were two different figures who led their own kind of local wargaming clubs.
Where they would play big games of miniatures with little toy soldiers on tables.
Both Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson were getting a little bit bored, and they're both very creative people, and they were looking for kind of the next step. Both of them independently started doing games based on kind of medieval fantasy settings.
Somebody decided to attack a castle with a small party by going up through the dungeon, and that somehow sparked this thought that you could run a game a little bit differently with one person being a dungeon master.
And the game that will become known as Dungeons & Dragons begins to evolve.
Between them came up with the idea of, hey, you know, it isn't just about how fast and far this guy can move and how far he can fire an arrow and how hard he can swing a sword, but how about if we give these people, these characters, these little lead miniatures, some personality and some opportunities to talk about stuff and talk to each other, and you know, all of a sudden you've got a whole new game, a whole new game type.
Instead of playing armies, you played a single person. And that was the real step. I mean, instead of moving pieces around a board, you became a person inside a world. It was all in their minds. You know, they were imagining everything as it happened, but it was really a world that they were wandering through.
So it all started out as miniature stuff and then turned into something that I don't think anybody saw how big it was going to get.
Gary Gygax sees an opportunity and decides to publish and sell the game himself.
The early success of Dungeons & Dragons was very much a snowball effect. They published it locally. You know, they had some distribution, but it was really college students that spread it. You know, people would go to college, come back at break and say, hey, this game, you know, I found this game, you guys have to play it. And it really spread by word of mouth, underground, but really, really strongly. I mean, by the end of the decade, you know, it was a cultural phenomenon in the way that certainly no war game ever had been before.
To satisfy a growing fan base, in 1979, Gary releases an update called Advanced Dungeons & Dragons.
Took the game to a whole nother level, and we all just went berserk when these books came out. Big hardcover books, just packed full of just all sorts of cool stuff. And the game became more complicated. There was more options of things you could do to your character.
While a new generation of gamers begin exploring D&D, a little invention known as the computer begins piquing interest across the country.
Without D&D, there wouldn't be any computer games. Okay, there might be like Pong or something, you know, but I mean, everybody who's driving a Ferrari in this business, and everybody who isn't driving a Ferrari, for that matter, ought to get down and, you know, turn northwards towards Wisconsin every day, you know, and just say a little prayer of thanks.
You could do things with computers that you couldn't conceive of in the real world. They seemed simple, but it's like you had control over this new environment in a way that, you didn't in your ordinary life.
Here was a way to, for us to realize all these fantasies that we had lived all those years, or that we had imagined, I guess. We were now able to live them. And when all these sort of, geeky guys started programming and all of a sudden, wow, Ultima, Might and Magic, Bard's Tale, you name it. It all comes back to people recreating their D&D campaigns at some level.
Dungeons & Dragons is one of three things that really sort of jump-started the game industry. You can't talk about D&D without going to Tolkien. So these kids read Tolkien, and then they created their own Tolkien-esque world with Dungeons & Dragons. It stands to reason when you sort of stand back now and look at the line that it was exactly these kinds of people who, when the new technology, when computers came along, it was them. It was these people that were playing these games. So naturally, since they had just created a paper game based on Tolkien, they're then going to try to create a digital game based on Dungeons & Dragons, which is based on Tolkien. And what you find, literally, from 1977 to 1995, is that everybody who was developing games, not everybody, but most of the people that we talked to, which was quite a few people, all said, love Tolkien, love D&D, and then needed to recreate that on the computer. And it was just over and over and over and over and over again.
Dungeons & Dragons continues to shape the future of gaming. But a tragedy will soon focus an angry public eye on this new pastime.
Then, since it's a role-playing game, you'll see people dressed up in full garb. Well, then it gets creepy if you don't really understand, this is sort of part of, this is part of the experience. And there was a hysteria about that. Dungeons & Dragons was heavy metal before heavy metal was heavy metal. It was the thing that people were really afraid of.
After a decade of relative obscurity, Dungeons & Dragons is about to reach new levels of exposure. But not all of it is good.
Dungeons & Dragons has been the center point for a lot of anger throughout the years.
I remember my mother was just unbelievably scared that I was playing this game that destroyed people's minds. It drove you mad. If you get that deep into your imagination and you start pretending you're someone else and you start, wielding a sword as you play this game and dressing up and speaking funny, I think people were worried that kids were going to get caught up in, demonic, anti-religious stuff or go crazy, all of which is crazy.
And then if you really understand that it's a game about stories, and it's a game of fantasy, and it's a game that essentially needs to be played with other people, you can't really play it by yourself and have fun, some of that fear goes away, because you realize your kid really isn't, Lothar the pagan wizard.
But the intense public scrutiny only helps Dungeons & Dragons find a new audience.
I'd say the recognition of it as a potentially dangerous, satanic thing probably helped it. If you're a kid or a young male, anyone under 30 really, having the establishment say, hey, this is dangerous, you're going to take another look. It's like, if you can make your parents a little disturbed that you're playing a game, it's like, hey, that's cool, let's try it out.
D&D is being played in imaginations everywhere.
I remember when I started at TSR, I think the received wisdom that we had something like 15 million active players on an ongoing basis at that time. That was back in the mid-'80s, I guess. And that's a pretty big chunk of people.
Due to its rising popularity, TSR, the company Gary Gygax used to publish Dungeons & Dragons, decides to license a series of computer games using the complex Dungeons & Dragons rule set. Strategic Simulations Incorporated, or SSI, takes players into a familiar adventure called the Pool of Radiance.
I was working at TSR when the license got signed with SSI, and the games were certainly very successful. I thought they were such amazingly faithful recreations of the D&D experience.
The game allows players to move a party of characters through a dungeon, just as if they were in a real game of Dungeons & Dragons, but without the need for a dungeon master.
At the time the SSI games came out, I was just getting into computers. I was a teenager, and I started picking up the Gold Box games and a few of their other titles because it was just a lot of fun. The SSI games were nice because it was like playing a D&D module. Because I would play for, you know, a few weeks or a month, and then I'd want to move on to something else. And here was a module just like a D&D module where there was a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I could play my D&D party, and my friends would come over and they'd start their own parties, and we'd have our different save discs. And we would take notes and pass them on to each other. It was almost like being in an adventurers club where people would say, oh, hey, you know, when you get down to level 16, go behind the gold door, but, you know, don't attack the wizard because he'll blow you away, you know. And it was a lot of fun. It provided almost a sort of live gaming experience with a computer game.
The computer allows users to focus more on the gaming and less on the logistics. The success of the Pool of Radiance leads to more D&D licensed games. Some of them take advantage of the power of the computer to provide unique methods of gameplay and perspective.
I don't know what it was, but even then, it's like I immediately gravitated towards Hillsfire, a game that no one remembers really. I mean, it's the forgotten Gold Box game. But it had this one little mechanic. It had a lock-picking mechanic that wasn't driven by those stats, and that wasn't just a recreation of the paper role-playing experience. And even then, I guess, I mean, I just wanted to exploit what this piece of hardware and this medium does that other media don't. I mean, that just seemed important to me.
A computer game offers different things to a gamer than a paper and pencil. Part of it is a sense of immediacy. Something is happening right now, right there. In a paper and pencil game, usually the DM will say something, and you'll get to talk with your friends in the party, or you'll think about it or whatever, and nothing's going to happen right this second unless the DM is really driving the action. The computer doesn't wait for you. You know, if there's a monster running down the hallway, unless you hit the pause button or something, it's still running down. You have to do something.
Using new technology, SSI decides to let the character play in a first-person perspective.
Every once in a while they do something innovative, like Eye of the Beholder was, to me, the first time I remember what you would now call a third-person perspective, where instead of looking down at essentially representations of miniatures, you'd be looking at what you were fighting. And that was pretty cool. So they would try different things like the Eye of the Beholder series. It was a lot of fun.
SSI continues to release games using the Dungeons & Dragons license, but the market wanes.
I think the real answer, it isn't much of a mystery. I mean, I think it's just that after a while, any license needs to be rested. I mean, people just get tired of the same stuff. And I think it's just people were looking for novelty. They were looking for something new, and they couldn't find it in D&D licensed games anymore, at least for a while.
And improvements in technology lead to gameplay so immersive that it draws people away from the role-playing games of the past.
I think Doom really sent Dungeons & Dragons type games into decline. Doom-style games are addictive. You know, you sit down and you play and you get drawn in, and they're fast and they're scary and they get your adrenaline going in a way that most role-playing games don't. Doom really changed the market. I mean, it was a turning point.
And just as the Dungeons & Dragons computer games begin to lose their audience, TSR also begins a wobbly spiral that points to bankruptcy and a game that really does have an end.
TSR found out it was in kind of financial trouble, and people were wondering what was going to happen next.
Just as TSR, who 20 years earlier had first published Dungeons & Dragons, was going out of business, a company called Wizards of the Coast sweeps in and saves the day.
Well, then along came Peter Atkinson and Wizards of the Coast. Peter and a man named Richard Garfield had created a card game called Magic the Gathering. It became enormously successful, and Wizards of the Coast purchased DSR.
Not only does work begin on a new rule set for the paper game, but a computer game is created that will bring Dungeons & Dragons back to monitors everywhere.
Well, Greg and I have always been huge fans of role-playing games. There hadn't been a lot of role-playing games released for a number of years before BG came out in '98.
And so that was pretty cool, because I was like, you know, games like Pool of Radiance were very inspiring to us, so the opportunity to work on a D&D game, Dungeons & Dragons RPG, like the next generation of it, was really exciting, so we just jumped on it.
Baldur's Gate provided a unique game experience. It took the whole top-down perspective of the SSI Gold Box games to a new level. You had a much more fluid combat system. You had more options as to like spell casting and character class and everything. And of course you had much better graphics and sounds. If the old SSI games were lacking in anything that they could have possibly had, they didn't have a lot of story or background. Baldur's Gate games did. You know, you had to solve a puzzle, you had to learn about the world, and they really conveyed that. Baldur's Gate is a story as much as it is a game.
The game successfully replicates the D&D rule set, allowing players to focus on the story and characters that make up the world they explore.
It clicked on a lot of things and just did them right. You could have a whole party of characters. You could pause the action. You could individually command what each character was doing. So if you're a D&D fan, here was a great way to go in and play a game where you could basically test out some of your ideas about tactics and that sort of thing.
And we were really careful to remain true to the license. One of the things we're very careful about when we work on licenses like Dungeons & Dragons or Star Wars is that we want to make sure that we retain the original vision. The fans they deserve to get what they're expecting. If they're expecting a game that's true to that original rule set or that universe, they should see it in the final title.
The success of the game leads to several sequels, all of which become bestsellers.
It was also based on the Dungeons & Dragons license, and I think that had a big part in getting the name recognition out for the title. It gave us a starting point that allowed us to kind of leap off and get more people knowing about it.
And now, a new type of game lurks over the horizon, one that will bring the social element back.
So, you know, the natural extension of taking D&D is to a computer. You combine that with the internet, and all of a sudden you have the opportunity for the massively multiplayer RPGs like EverQuest and Final Fantasy, and that just takes the coolness factor up a whole nother level.
Ultima Online and EverQuest paved the way for a steady stream of other massively multiplayer online role-playing games.
They can play with those games, and they can interact with each other. Even if it isn't quite the same as sitting across the table, you can still instant message your friend, and you can talk out of character, and you can go on an adventure together. It's great that there's that avenue.
But some people still feel there are fundamental differences between these games and a true Dungeons & Dragons experience.
Online games right now typically ask you to accept a world where everybody is a hero. And in a D&D campaign, it was you with 5 of your buddies going in and being heroes. And that's very different. It's when you're alone, solving really big problems and acting heroically. That's very different than standing in line while the guy in front of you kills a dragon and gets the experience, and then you walk up and kill the dragon and get the experience, and then it, you know, rematerializes and the guy behind you does it. I mean, when everybody's killing that dragon, nobody's a hero, and D&D is all about being heroes.
Despite the popularity of the online games, other companies continue to pursue the single-player experience, including a game that promises to allow players to create adventures for their friends and recreate their favorite adventures from the past.
The more recent Dungeons & Dragons games are, if anything, even more faithful recreations of the original game, and you gotta respect the polish and professionalism with which they've been implemented. They're telling some really cool stories. They're letting players, pick their roles in very traditional ways. And I love the fact that they're character-driven, story-based experiences.
As we look back over the past 30 years, it's hard to find a game that hasn't been influenced by Dungeons & Dragons.
Dungeons & Dragons has had an amazing impact on society that a lot of people, I don't think, are really aware of. And that effect is just being the game that laid out, this is what fantasy gaming is. The whole category of role-playing games, they're pen and paper based, all grows out of Dungeons & Dragons.
And looking into the future, companies will continue to try and perfect the experience of playing Dungeons & Dragons without actually playing.
The idea of Dungeons & Dragons, I think, is driving the simulations like There.com. Ultimately, that may be what the legacy of Dungeons & Dragons is. Like, this is what started it, and it's this idea that drives this stuff.
The future for Dungeons & Dragons, I think, is very bright. For one thing, I think that no matter how fancy the computers get, it's still fun to sit around a table with all your friends and play a game in kind of slow motion where everybody can see what everybody else has done. That experience is not going away. There's going to be the fusion of the best of both worlds, where you can get the fun of sitting around the table with your friends, but have the computer doing all the heavy lifting.